Oh, you're here. Good. I was hoping for company. You see, I've got stories, dark ones, chilling ones, the kind that keep you up at night. Mythical creatures, curses, horrors you can't escape. Shall we begin? Don't worry, I won't bite. Much.
I used to stay up late, never going to bed before 2 or 3 a.m. Whenever I got hungry, I'd open my food delivery app and randomly order something. Spicy crawfish, barbecue platters, whatever caught my eye. I'd place an order at midnight and start eating by 1. Not the healthiest lifestyle, but it was easygoing. Little did I know that one day something truly bizarre would happen to me. It was around 1 a.m. I was hunched over my desk playing games when my stomach let out a loud growl. I rummaged through my fridge and found nothing but 2 shriveled cucumbers. Just as I was about to give up and go to bed, my phone buzzed. An alert from my food delivery app. Midnight half-price deal. First come, first served. Half price? Hell yeah, who doesn't love a bargain? I clicked the link and saw a restaurant with a bizarre name. Yin Yang Cuisine. It sounded sketchy, but the discount was insane. A luxury meal that originally cost 60 yuan was now only 30. Surprisingly, the restaurant had a high rating, and the reviews were all glowing. So delicious I cried. Finally, a taste of home. The ultimate late-night lifesaver. The comments were so perfect they almost felt fake, but I was too hungry to care. I placed the order without thinking twice. Within 5 minutes, my order was accepted. The delivery guy's name was Old He. His profile only had a blurry picture, but I didn't care, as long as my food arrived fast. The delivery progress moved unusually quickly. When GPS showed he was near my building, I picked up my phone to call him and give him the door code. As soon as the call connected, a wave of static filled my ears, followed by a deep mechanical voice. Your delivery is at the door. How can I describe that voice? It was like a mix of a bass speaker and a broken tape recorder, with an eerie echo that sent chills down my spine. But I reasoned that maybe he had a sore throat or was using a Bluetooth headset that distorted his voice. Whatever, I thought. I just wanted my food. I grabbed my keys and headed downstairs. I lived in an old apartment building, and the hallway lights were always broken. I had to use my phone's flashlight to see where I was going. As I opened the entrance door, I saw a tall, skinny figure standing by the gate, dressed in a black delivery uniform, his posture stiff as a rod. Old He, right? Thanks for coming, I said. He didn't react at first. After a long pause, he slowly turned his head. I shone my flashlight on him and immediately felt my stomach drop. His face was ghostly pale, covered in a dusty gray film. His lips were an unnatural shade of purple, and the skin around his eyes was dark, almost black, like a panda's. My mind went blank. Before I could process anything, he shoved the food bag into my hands and spoke in a slow, heavy tone. Next time, don't order again. Then he turned around and walked up the stairs, his footsteps making a clacking sound, like he was wearing shoes with metal soles. I hesitated. Most delivery guys used e-bikes. Why was he wearing iron shoes? And wasn't he supposed to be heading downstairs? But at that moment, I was too freaked out to think about it. I clutched my food and hurried back inside. Back in my apartment, I couldn't shake the eerie feeling. Why did that delivery guy look so weird? I checked the time. It was almost 1:40 a.m. Maybe he was just exhausted from working late-night shifts. That would explain the sickly complexion. I opened the food box and nearly dropped it in shock. The dish looked nothing like the picture. I had ordered a spicy stir-fry, but the container held a pool of dark red liquid with strange, fleshy chunks floating inside. The strong, metallic scent of blood hit my nose. I frowned. Maybe this was some kind of extreme spicy dish? The reviews did say, so spicy it makes you cry. Maybe it just looked worse than it tasted? As I rummaged through the bag for utensils, I found no chopsticks or napkins, but there was a crumpled note with shaky handwriting. Run, quickly. A chill shot up my spine. Was this some kind of horror-themed restaurant prank? I wasn't a streamer. Why were they trying to scare me? Annoyed, I decided I'd just leave a bad review and request a refund. But just as I was about to close the food box, my phone pinged with a new message. Dear customer, due to special restaurant policies, this order must be consumed on site. Do not take the food outside the store. I almost threw my phone. I'm already home. How do they know I took the food away? I was furious. I tried calling customer service, but my call wouldn't go through. Then a chat message popped up instantly. We will send someone to retrieve the order. Please keep your door and windows open. The hell you will. I immediately locked my door, bolted it, and shut every window tight. If this was some kind of scam, they weren't getting in. Suddenly, I heard that clacking sound again. Footsteps in the hallway. But this time, it wasn't just one person. I started sweating. Heart pounding, I turned off my lights and peeked through the peephole. What I saw nearly made me pass out. 3 figures in black delivery uniforms stood outside my door. Their faces were identical to old He's, pale, expressionless, lifeless, but none of them wore helmets. Their unkempt hair floated slightly in the air, as if caught in an invisible breeze. They stood motionless, staring at my door, whispering something inaudible. Then, one of them raised a fist and knocked. Open the door. Give it back. Another one murmured, or you won't leave either. I wasn't about to stick around and find out what happened next. I remembered the note. Run. But how? My only exit was the front door, and they were right there. In a panic, I did the only thing I could think of. I called the police. My hands trembled as I dialed 110. The line crackled with static, and at first they couldn't hear me. I repeated myself over and over for 5 minutes as the knocking on my door grew more intense. Finally, the call connected. The operator told me to stay put and that officers were on the way. I pressed my ear to the door, waiting. Then, silence. When I finally dared to open the door a crack, the hallway was empty. No figures, no footprints, no food bag, just the eerie quiet of an abandoned building. I waited under a street lamp for the police, but no one came. When I called 110 again, they told me they had no record of my previous call. The next day I tried to find Yin Yang Cuisine in the app, but it was gone. My order history showed it had been canceled and my payment had been refunded. On my desk, the food was gone. Only the crumpled note remained. Run, quickly.
If I told you that tens of thousands of children had their records erased, their very existence denied by governments and institutions, would you believe me? If I told you that some of these children might still be alive, trapped in underground facilities, forced to participate in experiments that can never be exposed, would you be able to sleep at night? In the mid-20th century, multiple countries experienced waves of mass child disappearances, particularly among orphans, foster children, and those living in welfare institutions. They had no families, no one to search for them, no one to care where they had gone. That made them the perfect targets, victims of government projects, medical experiments, and illegal trafficking networks. Everything you're about to watch is based on true historical events. I will tell these stories through the eyes of those who lived them, but every word is grounded in real, documented history. I have never dared to go back to that place. The day before my 60th birthday, I received a package in the mail. Inside was an old black and white photograph, yellowed with age. It showed a group of children dressed in tattered clothes, standing outside a Quebec orphanage. Their faces were blank, their eyes hollow. On the back of the photograph, a single line was scrawled in messy handwriting. "Do you remember Thomas?" My fingers trembled as I held the picture. A flood of memories surged back, memories I had tried to bury for decades. Thomas? Of course I remembered him. I remembered how he would stand in the orphanage yard, staring up at the gray sky as if searching for a hidden secret. I remembered him whispering to me at night, warning me, "Don't drink the milk, don't trust the nuns when they smile, and whatever you do, don't open your eyes at night." But Thomas had disappeared long ago. They told me he had been adopted, but no one ever saw the family who took him. No one knew where he had gone. And now, someone was asking me if I still remembered him. I ran my fingers over the photograph, feeling its weight, as if the truth was imprinted deep within the paper. For years I had forced myself to believe that Thomas had simply been lucky, that he had found a home, just like the other children who had mysteriously vanished from the orphanage. I told myself they must have gone on to live happy lives. But had they? I grew up in St. Matthew's Orphanage. It was a cold, lifeless place with walls covered in cracked white plaster and a constant stench of disinfectant and rotting wood. Every day we were taken to prayer, fed moldy bread and watery soup, and taught one thing: obedience was the key to survival. Thomas was 3 years older than me. He was tall and thin, with pale skin and an eerie way of watching the nuns. He rarely spoke, but he was sharper than any of us. He could sneak an apple from the kitchen without anyone noticing, hide it under his mattress, and listen in on the low whispers of the headmistress and doctors, even when they spoke in French. One night he whispered something to me that I never forgot. "We're not orphans, Daniel. We're experiments." I didn't understand what he meant, but the way his voice trembled made me afraid. Nights at the orphanage were always cold. We huddled under thin blankets on the wooden beds, listening to the wind howling through the cracks in the windows. Sometimes, if you listened carefully, you could hear the heavy iron door at the end of the hallway creaking open. And sometimes children were taken. They never came back. "Where do they go?" I once asked the nuns. They smiled, but their eyes remained empty. "They've been adopted, dear. They've gone to a better place." But one night, I heard footsteps outside our dormitory. A moment later, I heard Thomas's voice, low, urgent, trembling with a fear I had never heard before. "Daniel, don't make a sound." The door opened. A group of nuns in black robes stood around his bed. Thomas didn't fight. He simply stared at them, unblinking. Then a man in a white doctor's coat stepped forward, holding a glass of milk. I held my breath as Thomas took the milk. He stared down at the glass for a moment, then smiled faintly and handed it back. "I'm not thirsty." The air in the room grew thick, suffocating. The nun's smiles vanished. The doctor's expression hardened, then he nodded. Two large men stepped forward, grabbed Thomas by the arms, and clamped a hand over his mouth. He didn't struggle, he just let them take him. That was the last time I ever saw him. The next morning, Thomas's bed was stripped clean. His name had been crossed off the orphanage records. His photograph was gone. It was as if he had never existed. I asked the other children, but they wouldn't answer me. Their eyes were filled with fear. Only one younger girl dared to whisper to me at night, clutching my hand. "They took him to the mental hospital," she said. "The ones who go there never come back." In 1999, the Canadian government declassified some of its records. They revealed that thousands of children had been illegally committed to mental institutions, where they were subjected to electroshock therapy, drug experiments, and even forced brain surgery. These were not mentally ill children. They were orphans, or children who had no one to fight for them. In 2004, investigative journalists uncovered a mass grave beneath an abandoned psychiatric hospital in Quebec. Inside were the remains of dozens of unnamed children, their ages ranging from infants to teenagers. No death records, no hospital records, no names. The government gave no clear explanation. Their official statements were vague. These were mistakes of the past. "We deeply regret what happened. But I remember the footsteps in the night. I remember the children who were taken. I remember the cold, silent stares of the doctors. And I never found Thomas. His name had been erased from every document. His life had been wiped from history, but I knew. The glass of milk, the silence of that night, the iron door that never reopened. He had been here. This is not fiction. It really happened. The Duplessis orphan scandal involved more than 5,000 children. The bones discovered in that unmarked grave may only be the tip of the iceberg. So how many children really disappeared? Where did they go? Are some of them still alive? Or were they erased as if they had never existed at all? Sometimes I dream about the ship. It drifts on an endless sea surrounded by darkness. I see myself standing on the deck, the wind tangling my hair, the salty air pressing against my skin. Around me, a group of children huddled together, dressed in ragged clothes, their faces frozen in fear and confusion. Then, the ship slowly pulls away from the shore, and with it, our past is erased. My mother died of tuberculosis, and my father vanished after the war. I was placed in the care of the government, labeled as unaccompanied, and sent to an orphanage. It wasn't the worst place to grow up. At least we had food, though never enough. The nuns were cold, but never cruel. Yet something always felt off. Every few months, children would disappear. They weren't adopted. They weren't claimed by lost relatives. They were simply sent somewhere better. At first, I thought this meant they had found new families, but no one ever heard from them again. No letters, no visits. Even the nuns stopped mentioning their names, as if they had never existed. "You're going to Australia," the nun told me one morning in 1952. "There will be new schools, a new family, warm sunshine, and beautiful farms. You're going to love it." We were taken to a ship crammed together with hundreds of other children. Some were older than me, others barely 5 years old. None of us spoke much. There was no excitement, no joy, just silence and uneasy glances. The lower decks were damp and reeked of vomit and mold. I asked one of the older boys, "Do you know where we're going?" He looked at me with an odd sadness in his eyes. "They say we're going to new families," he whispered, "but I don't believe them." I pressed my face against the small window, staring at the ocean stretching out into the unknown, and that was the moment I realized we weren't being sent to a better life. We were being sent into the unknown. When we arrived in Australia, we weren't taken to families. We weren't given warm welcomes. We were sorted into groups and sent to institutions, work camps, and religious homes. I ended up in a place called Bindi Children's Home, but it was not a home. It was a labor camp. We scrubbed floors, tended crops, and carried heavy buckets of water under the scorching sun. If we worked too slowly, we were beaten. But the worst part was the nights. Some children were taken away, sometimes for hours, sometimes forever. I once asked an older girl what was happening. She whispered, "Some of them never come back. Some were sent to farms as unpaid laborers, their tiny hands raw from endless hours of work. But others, no one knows." In the 1960s, I overheard a local man mention that wealthy families could purchase these children to serve as house servants, or worse, as playthings. Rumors spread of children being sent to secret facilities for psychological experiments, drug trials, and mind control research. Then there was a place called Blackstone House, a secluded facility where children were taken but never returned. No one ever confirmed these stories. No one ever admitted the truth. In 1987, the Australian government declassified certain documents. They confirmed that over 10,000 British children had been secretly shipped to Australia, Canada, and other countries without their parents' consent. They were not sent to loving homes. They were placed in work camps, religious institutions, and forced labor farms. Many were beaten, starved, and abused. Some were erased, their files destroyed, their fates unknown. In 2009, British Prime Minister Gordon Brown issued a formal apology. "We are truly sorry for what happened." But does an apology change anything? Does it bring back the missing children? I am an old woman now. My hands are wrinkled, too weak to hold the ship ticket I once carried. But I still remember that night, the night I sailed toward the unknown. I am still searching for my friends, the children who boarded that ship with me. But they have been forgotten by the world. Where did they go? Are any of them still alive? Or were they erased as if they had never existed at all?
Bray was a humble young man who lived in a small village at the foot of a remote mountain. He made a living by chopping wood for others and had some basic knowledge of medicinal herbs. Due to the shortage of labor in the village, his elder brother Jay and his sister-in-law Sue often hired him to help gather herbs or tend to the mountain fields. One early morning, as usual, Bray set off into the mountains with Sue, while his brother stayed behind to tend to other affairs. The mountain path was steep and the humid air made the journey exhausting. Sue soon became breathless. As they approached a ravine, she suddenly said she needed to relieve herself and told Bray to wait for her along the forest path. He busied himself searching for useful herbs nearby while reminding her to be careful of venomous insects and snakes. A long while passed. Suddenly a sharp scream pierced through the forest. Bray's heart tightened. He dashed toward the source of the sound, pushing through ancient trees entwined with vines. At last, on a slope, he saw Sue. Her face was deathly pale, and she clutched a machete tightly in her trembling hands. Her clothes were splattered with blood, and at her feet lay the corpses of two massive snakes, both decapitated, though their bodies still twitched faintly. Sue's voice was hoarse as she stammered, They suddenly lunged at me, hissing like they were going to bite. I panicked and swung my blade. She was still visibly shaken. Bray felt a chill down his spine, but didn't think too much of it. After all, venomous snakes were common in the mountains, and slashing at them in fear was not unheard of. They hurriedly gathered their herbs and firewood before making their way back home. The next morning, Bray went to his brother's house as usual to help out. However, the house was eerily quiet. Normally, his brother and sister-in-law would have already started their daily routines at dawn, but today there was no sound at all. He knocked on the door and called out, but no one responded. The door was slightly ajar. Bray pushed it open, and a putrid stench of blood rushed at him, nearly making him vomit on the spot. His brother and sister-in-law lay sprawled on the ground in a pool of blood. Their heads were missing. The room was in complete disarray. Bray's face turned ashen. Panic surged through him, and he immediately ran to report the gruesome scene to the local authorities. Yet, to his horror, he quickly became the prime suspect. Rumors spread that he had harbored illicit feelings for his sister-in-law and had killed his brother in a fit of jealousy. Desperate, Bray vehemently protested, "I would never harm them. Could this have something to do with the snake Sue killed yesterday?" But tales of vengeful serpents sounded absurd, and few believed him. The county magistrate arrived with his officers to investigate. Inside the house, they discovered an unusual blood trail. It was as if something wet and slippery had been dragged across the floor, leaving a winding, sinister smear leading out into the yard. The blood was dark and thick, emitting a nauseating stench. Following the trail, the officers traced it all the way to an ancient well behind the village. The well was centuries old, its stone walls cracked and covered in moss. Strange, indistinct carvings adorned its rim. The area around it was overgrown with weeds, and villagers rarely approached it. The officers examined the well's edge and found more bloodstains, along with marks that resembled something slithering into the darkness below. The well's depths were pitch black and unknowable. The magistrate's face darkened. Finally, he ordered, "Lower a bucket and search the well." A few strong laborers secured a rope and began lowering a wooden bucket into the abyss. Moments later, a terrified voice echoed from below, "Pull it up! Pull it up now!" The officers hauled up the bucket with all their might. When it emerged, its contents sent shivers down everyone's spines. The wooden pail was filled with putrid, congealed blood, and at the very bottom lay two severed human heads, Wang Shi and Su. Their faces were frozen in sheer terror, as if they had been brutally decapitated in the midst of unimaginable horror. But the most chilling sight was what lay beneath them. Two massive, headless snake corpses. Their swollen bodies were covered in eerie, dark markings. One officer gasped, "Aren't those the same snakes Sue killed yesterday? How did they end up at the bottom of this well, and why are the heads here?" A heavy silence fell upon the crowd. Even the magistrate took a few cautious steps back, his face as pale as a sheet. The sheer eeriness of the scene defied logic. Bray's legs gave out and he collapsed to the ground. He recalled Sue's terrified expression when she had killed the snakes. He remembered how the decapitated creatures had continued to writhe, as if refusing to die. A deep, icy fear settled into his bones. After deliberation, the magistrate finally declared, "The heads have been recovered, proving the killer was someone, or something else. While Bray remains a suspect, what lies in the well is beyond human capability. There is no evidence to convict him." Though Bray was cleared of suspicion, no one could explain how the snakes and severed heads ended up in the well, entwined as if cursed. Some claimed it was the work of vengeful spirits. Others whispered that the snakes had possessed some dark sorcery, taking revenge on their killers. The truth, however, remained an enigma. From that day on, villagers avoided the well at all costs. No one dared to approach it, especially at night. It was said that on moonless nights, eerie rustling noises could be heard from its depths, as if something was still writhing below. Some who dared to peer into the darkness swore they saw two swollen, monstrous snakes staring up from the abyss. Their grotesque bodies coiled together, and on their backs two pale, ghostly faces could be seen, featureless yet brimming with overwhelming hatred. This gruesome legend became known as the Curse of the Ancient Well. Overcome with fear and the weight of the village's judgment, Bray eventually left and never returned.